Hello and welcome to the St. Paul Sun. I am your host, Gay. I am joined today with my guest, Metric Giles. Metric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well today.
Wonderful.
Happy to be here.
Wonderful. We're happy to have you. Now, Metric is with the Community Civilization Project, and actually you're the executive director there. So I actually wanted to talk a little bit first, going into your background before we come to the Community Civilization Project. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you kind of ended up where you are today.
Well, I'm from a very spiritual family, a family with a background in spirituality.
Okay.
My father was a minister.
Okay.
And I'm have the background of family pride.
Okay.
So before it was proud to be an African or black, it was like instilled in us to be proud to be a Giles, which is what my last name is. Mm-hmm. So we come back from that background of being a Giles, and that being a Giles meant that you needed to present yourself with some type of values that represented the whole family. So that's kind of like the base of where I came from. Along that way, I had 3 brothers, and my mother especially, because I had no girls, sisters, she wanted us to be very independent and not to depend on people, or especially on. She didn't want her boys to depend on women. That's what it was. And it wasn't like in a bad way, but she said not to have to accept what someone offered you, that you always had another option of pursuing that. Okay. So I'm just saying that as a base. But my father, he was like real broader, that if you didn't like what somebody else was offering you, then you better have a plan to come up with another option so that you didn't have to accept that as well in life.
Wow.
So my background, born in Chicago, where I never seen any white people other than on TV.
Wow. What part of Chicago?
That was south side of Chicago. And so I think that's what happens to a lot of people. They, even Europeans, where they never see any black people.
Outside of this television.
Like, and the image of being able to see television was real powerful, because the perception is white people are all powerful. There was no positive black images. And then I moved to Mason City, Iowa, which was totally European, and there I learned the lesson of assimilation in environment, in the culture. So when I first came there in 2nd grade, the first lesson I learned, but I didn't know what it was, the teacher was teaching reading a book, Little Black Sambo. Everybody looked at me. Everybody else was white in the class, but she's reading this book by Little Black Sambo, looked at me, and I wondered why did everybody look at me. But I knew it had something to do with the story, Little Black Sambo.
Right.
4 years or 5 years later, in 6th grade, my best friend, who was a white boy, he said, the last one down to the end of the field is a nigger. And I was going to be the first one down there, because I wasn't thinking that I was a nigger or anything. I had probably got used to hearing the word nigger and not thinking it had anything to do with me.
Right.
All my other so-called friends turned around and said to me, did you hear what he called you? He just called you a nigger. My best friend wasn't trying to call me a nigger, but the other kids and everything still knew that I was different from them.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, that's assimilation. You get so caught up in your environment that you forget your true identity. Who you are.
And we were actually, before the show came on, we were talking a little bit about identity. So since we started with your background, I want to kind of get into that again before we talk more about the housing neighborhoods here. When we talk about identity, we're talking about how people's identity can be defined, right? And how sometimes people can have their identity taken away from them. And we spoke particularly about slavery and the emancipation, and how that may have put blacks on a trajectory to not knowing their real true identity or acceptance of Africa. Can you talk a little bit about that for people out there, just that idea of emancipation and identity, and how that may have been taken away from the black community?
Okay. So you referenced something about slaves and slavery to me.
Yes, sir.
And I asked you, well, so who came from Africa, something like that?
Yes.
And you said slaves. And I said, well, no, slaves did not come from Africa. Africans came from Africa and was instituted into slavery. But even intellectuals, academics, history, and all the books, it always has a reference to slaves coming from Africa. And specifically, I said to you that what did Abraham Lincoln do? And you said he emancipated the slaves. I said, well, no, he did not do that either. But that was the turning point of direction for African Americans in the United States. If he had just simply said, or if history had documented that he emancipated the Africans, it would have kind of like moved us in a total direction of progress, of reconnecting to our origin of identity. Being referred to as he emancipated the slaves, we kind of digress into that institution of slavery. We became the institution, and for the people of America related to white supremacy, it might have been intentional that they wanted to keep us in that state of mind. They
slaves.
changed, right. Might have been very intentional. We was emancipated name-wise, but by continuing to have the identity of slaves, we just moved into another era of being slaves.
And when we talk about that identity, right, still being identified as slaves. Now, looking in today's current realm and current society, how do you think that has played out? Having that history and that background, being emancipated as slaves and not as Africans.
Well, the fact that one is to disconnect us with not only our country of identity, it disconnect us with our people as well. So it's kind of like, I asked you, where was you from? You said, I'm from Liberia. And I said, well, you know what? I'm from Ghana. I'm Ghanaian America. Most African Americans in America cannot refer to themselves as to their country of origin. So it's kind of like, we have spent a lot of energy in America trying to redefine who we are. You know, from niggers to Negro to colored people to blacks. We're still trying to spend a lot of energy into and whereas most of the other people that has come here, they come in here with that identity and they move forward from there.
Right. So I mean, because we did touch on other cultures. You talked about Jews, and you talked about even the Israelites from a biblical sense, and we talked about these different groups who, even though they went through enslavement or they went through situations where they were looked down upon, or what's the better word to use, that they were being used or by other people.
But like slavery is nothing new historically.
Exactly.
There has always been a conquest,
exactly,
and those who was defeated became enslaved by the victors.
By victors. So we look at that situations for other groups, and they're able to keep their identity. Within the black community, right? We talked about that lack of identity existing. Do you think that is to blame, or is a factor in some of the violence and also some of the disconnect we see in some of the black communities? One, with African people, right? But then also just in African Americans in general, from gang violence, some of those things. There's not as much it seems like a uniting force sometimes, people say, in the black community. Do you think that plays a role at all?
Well, it definitely plays a role in the sense that one, it's like if you have nothing that grounds you and there's this void, it's kind of like alcohol. You stop using alcohol, but if you don't provide something else concrete to substitute for it, at a certain point in time, when you get tired of fighting the resistance, what do you go back to? You go back to alcohol. So with us, the institution that suppressed us, oppressed us, was white supremacy. So the fact that we had no identity to go back to, what did we refer back to? Which was capitalism. We individually can always succeed, individually. Collectively, we have not had a collective growth, because what we merged back into is that same white supremacy, capitalism. And so we just become part of that, and we we can then continue the oppression to ourselves. You know, it's not like white people don't do bad things to each other.
Exactly.
You know, I mean,
Right.
they do bad things to each other too,
Everybody does.
but we just take on that same practices and the circumstances and the symptoms, all these isms. I refer to myself as a recovering chauvinist because part of the ism that even as a black man that I'm a part of is that we live in a male-dominated society. That came through white supremacy too. So even as a black male,
You have that.
I
ism
have
to
that,
work with.
and I'm aware of it.
Right.
So if I wasn't aware of it, I would continue to be a chauvinist.
Right.
Or else, because I have 6 daughters, that led me to awareness, application, and practice of being a recovering chauvinist.
So it's recovery. So, Metric, we're going to take one quick break here, and we'll be right back to the St. Paul Sun with Metric Giles. Thank you, Metric. And welcome back to the St. Paul Sun. I am your host once again, Bay Gay, back here with Metric Giles. Go ahead, get Metric. Now, before we went into the break, we were speaking a little bit about identity and identity within the African American community. Now, I kind of want to take that conversation and bring it back into the realm of housing, right? Because we talked about how identity makes for disconnect between people, makes for lack of communication, makes for a situation where people may fall into a system. Now, the biggest system that we have in America here is probably our housing system because how people stay off the streets. Now, talk a little bit about the Community Civilization Project and what you guys look to do when it comes to housing in the St. Paul Rondo community neighborhood.
So we're not just for the Rondo community.
Absolutely.
We're a citywide community stabilization project. Our motto is tenant stability leads to community stability. And the reason we say that within any given community, 30 to 70% of the housing population is renters. So you're not able to say you have a stable community if that portion of your community is not stable.
Right.
So it's essential that we elevate renters, tenants to a same equitable level of value, of decision making, policy development with any other classification of housing, of homeowners, property owners, multifamily, if it's condos. Being a renter is just as valued. So we at CSP, we use the Minnesota state statutes as a base foundation to providing the rights and responsibilities based on those Minnesota state statutes for tenants and landlords. What that does is provide self-empowerment. We cannot empower anyone, but we can provide the knowledge, the education about those rights and responsibility that people have, and through that, it creates a more solid relationship.
And it does create empowerment. And then what you're talking about is stabilizing the community through education. Now, I know that's one element, but what would you say are all the elements that come into play when it comes to stabilizing the community overall?
Okay. Well, the piece of what we do, number one, we do a lot of collaborations. And I remember being at a conference about 4 years ago. It was a Revolution conference or something like that. But the key piece that came from the federal administration said that we can no longer work from silos for the different systems that are, like housing, transportation, health, education.
Right.
They're all overlapping.
Okay.
So housing is essential to everyone.
Right.
So, but we still have to recognize that there's a continuity that exists with the other systems.
Right.
So with the renters housing and tenants housing, it's very important. A guy asked me, he said, well, what is the biggest issue that you have on an ongoing basis in the renter community.
Yeah.
I say the biggest issue right now is the status of what the renter is. That the renter is not perceptibly received as being equal or equitable to a homeowner or a property owner. Thus, they're missing at the table when decisions and policies are being decided about them. And equity means that anything that is impacting you, that you're a stakeholder, that you need to participate in that.
Have an opinion. Right, and why do you think that is? There's this disconnect, because you did talk to me over the break about how in those communities, in any community, that renters or people who actually quote unquote own their houses are also still paying somebody else. They also still have that same element of circumstantial eviction, depending on each of the cases. So why do you think that status exists, where there's how homeowners take on this level and their renters are looked at down here?
Well, the big piece of what happens now is based on history. So the people that kind of like put the platform, the foundation of how this democracy was going to be, facilitated, ran, applied, was homeowners, landowners, and once again, those landowners, homeowners, those people of status was Europeans, so the laws and everything have filtered down from that place of ownership.
Yes.
So if in the community right now, statistically, especially in Minnesota, 70% of Europeans are homeowners.
Wow.
70% of homeowners in any given community as homeowners. So 30% of people of color are homeowners.
Yeah.
So if we kind of flip that aside, at 70% of Europeans are homeowners, that also make 70% of people of color renters.
Yeah.
So, and if we're saying that the emphasis has always been put on property owners, then the policies and the decisions that have been made, legislative on city, local, county, federal levels, are from what perspective? From the perspective of the people in power, of the homeowners, the property owners. So it's a really big mission of CSP to say, hey, no, we can no longer go under that format. That being a renter is just as a viable and equitable and value of a position. Not everyone actually needs to have this badge of success based on if they're a renter or a homeowner.
It wouldn't matter either way. Right. So going off of that, right, we talk about stabilizing the community and making sure people are considered equal regardless of whether you're a renter or you're a homeowner. And think of you personally, with your background and your history, why did you decide that this was the cause that you wanted to champion and come towards? And then I think even more importantly, why do you think it is so important for us to stabilize our communities and make them safe for everybody? Speaking particularly for St. Paul and this neighborhood that you've chosen to serve.
Well, you referred in the beginning to the Rondo community.
Yes, sir.
And actually, most people would refer, if we're talking about African Americans, it's a reflection of the Rondo community historically.
Yeah.
It became the Rondo community because it was involuntarily, this was the only place that we could live. Segregation. That's why this was considered, this is where black people could live.
Wow.
So coming from that place of like, this is the only place we could live, we still had that stigma of this is a black community. But in reality, we're all over the place right now. But just because we're all over the place, when I say all over the place, we live everywhere. I mean, when I was a kid, I went to school in Frogtown, where we are right now.
Yeah.
But at the end of that school day, I had to make sure I made it home before it was dark. And my brother, who was younger than me, he also had to make sure he made it home. And he actually did have white gangs chasing him home from the Frogtown community.
Wow.
So,
in the north, in Minnesota?
Here in Minnesota, right here.
What year is this?
That was probably in the 80s maybe. There was a time that a black person didn't walk down Rice Street. Wow. What you see right now, you did not see. You have scattered sites you had scattered, not sites, you had scattered individual locations where black people live. I had a grandfather, and I would drive him around on the weekends. He said, black people live here now? Because we were really segregated. I mean, and you didn't go on the east side, you didn't go over to the down Wright Street. You didn't do those things. So when we come back to housing, even though we're still there, the laws, the policies, the application of that has not caught up to our presence. There's still
increased African American presence.
yeah, not. I mean, we're there, but how we interact in the systems.
Right.
So that's why if we want to, we have to not just be invited to the tables, invited into the community, but our values have to be placed on the table as well.
So inserting African American values into policy making.
And African American values, renters' values, and it just is honorable, respectful values. I mean, even if we move beyond like this is an African American or this is an Asian, or that's just some basic inherited rights that we all have to what President Roosevelt, way back in 1944, he was going to come up with the Second Bill of Rights. And that was inclusive of all people of color, that we have inherited rights that we all should have, transportation, health. If he had lived, we would have a national health way back from 1944.
Wow.
But, I mean, all those things that, I'm getting off the subject here.
No,
I'm moving,
Educate us, brother.
but we're talking about capitalism, and we're talking about white supremacy. No, it's not racism. Racism is just one of the circumstances of white supremacy and capitalism. White supremacy and capitalism being one and the same. So, in a capitalistic system, what is one of the main values of a capitalistic system?
Well, it's profit. Right? It's about making profit.
And free enterprise, right?
Yeah, everybody has the freedom to make money. Yeah.
So in that, one of the basic, like value or characteristics of it, there's going to be some people who make a lot of money, some people who make a little money.
Yeah.
Which people are penalized?
People who are making low money.
All right, and we classify them as low income.
Yes.
And we kind of make it seem like you're having a low income is the problem.
Yeah.
But that's never going to change, not in a capitalistic system. That's a variable that in a free enterprise, it has to exist in a capitalistic system. So why are we penalizing people who make less than the people who make money on the top? So in stabilizing the community, and we stop referring to that the problem is that I make less than you make high income, I make low income, so my making low income is a problem. But we just say, well, okay, how do we make sure that metric has just as much of an opportunity to resources, to services and opportunities equitably?
Yes.
And that it creates a well-being of life, a quality of life for me, regardless if I make a high or low income. We need to refocus and redefine. So in this system that we have, one of the other characteristics of white supremacy is that if we define people, we can control the outcomes of that, and we can have those continuations.
Wow, this brother is preaching. We're going to take one more break, Metric, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. I want to talk about the details of white supremacy and capitalism and how it really is impacting this neighborhood. This is the St. Paul Sun, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the St. Paul Sun. I am your host, Bay Gay, back here with my man Metric, Giles Metric. We've been having an amazing conversation. Unfortunately, we have just a little bit before we close it out. So I want to shift to something here that I definitely wanted to touch on before I let you go, which is the education. And education in St. Paul, but in the black community in general. During the break, we talked a little bit about how that there's a lack of true historical education for African Americans currently in America, right? One, how do you think that system, let's talk about how that system came to be, one, and two, how it's affecting and adversely affecting students today.
Well, one, everything reconnects to this whole structure of the American system of white supremacy and capitalism. So if African Americans was missing from being included in the education system, I looked up some Jim Crow laws that used to exist, and it was against the law to educate blacks, you know. So I asked you the question, what happened in 1954? What happened in 1974?
So,
So 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. That was 61 years ago, right? So, and
not that long.
yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying. Historically, in 61 years, and prior to that, that we really wasn't really included in the overall structure of education. And then in 1974, in the home of freedom, the Tea Party and all that in Boston, they had to bring in the National Guard for a black person to walk into a white school. So we're talking less than 40 years. How do we have a balance of equitable, you know, like when they say the achievement gap and why we had so much disparities with African Americans? Once again, we're invited into the schools, but we don't have a school system that is relevant and inclusive. So we have to do that, you know.
Well, when it comes to the structure of education, it is such a top-down thing. How do we start doing it from even a basic level for our kids in the community when we talk about, because I think that goes into community, that's civilization and community building. How do we start to do that on a local level for our children, try to educate them about their black history?
Well, the first piece of it, we as people, not just parents, we have to start being involved in the school systems, of the systems that are educating our children. In the school system, three things has to become standards of learning. Civic engagement, because it's a system that we have that controls everything. Civic engagement, financial management, and then restorative justice, conflict resolution. Those are three things that has to be instilled in our school system, because those are things that keep us at a distance. And the last one, the conflict management, we're at the top of the list. I want to talk about the miseducation of the Negro, of us as black people, the students and the parents and the people, and also not just blacks. Carter G. Woodson, he put that book out in 1900s, early 1900s, Miseducation. He had that knowledge, that insight, foresight to say we had to change the conditioning, the blindness that we have about the education of us, number one. And what we have failed to do is continue intentionally. Now, we have people writing books, but we can't just write the books. We have to have an application to make sure that people are receiving the knowledge that are in those books. And then doing that across sectional. It can't just be old folks knowing or just young people. Somehow we have to start putting this together and educating ourselves cross generation. You know, it's kind of like if we continue to do it from silos of people, of systems, we will end up in the same place we are right now, education-wise. And I want to end up on a positive note that we can do this through our programs and education and what we're doing here right now. Perfect. But we have to talk, and then we have to have a action. How do we put this conversation into an application of action and change?
Thank you very much. Peace and sunshine to you all, everybody.